Okay, everybody, very welcome to this very important and interesting discussion. We call it fåtölj-samtal here, and which means that we put someone here and we gently discuss between us, and by that we hope that we will get a lot of information. These micros are for the YouTube direct and digitally, and not for you, so we have to talk loudly, and I hope that you hear what I say. With this, I will introduce Dan Smith, who is presently the director of SIPRI, and we are today going to discuss SIPRI. This is within a number of meetings we have had on different development institutions in Sweden. Actually, this is the fourth in a series of these discussions. And today we are dividing the discussion in two parts. The first part, which I will head or be discussion partner, is on SIPRI, its history, what's supposed to do, and where it's heading in the future, and particularly in this changing climate or political climate in the world and in Sweden, particularly in Sweden. The second part, Annika Söder will lead, and this is trying to talk about the content of what the SIPRI is doing, and with a particular emphasis on Europe. So, with these words, you are all welcome, and particularly Dan Smith.
Thank you.
And I'll ask you to start this discussion by presenting SIPRI, its purpose, and what you have done so far. I mean,
sure.
More looking backwards in this first.
So, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, was founded in 1966, and the idea was to mark and celebrate that Sweden had just spent 150 years without being involved in a war. The person whom we sort of regard as our founding mother is Alva Myrdal, and there's a somewhat apocryphal story about her which catches the essence of what she wanted to do, which is that she attended disarmament conference meetings in Geneva and came back, and according to the apocryphal story, said that the problem is that almost nobody there knows what they're talking about, literally. So the Americans know what they're talking about, the Soviets know what they're talking about, the Brits and the French know what they're talking about. After that, it gets a little bit loose because there's no independent source of information. So part of the thinking was that SIPRI should be an independent source of information. And the first director, who was British, Robert Neild, a Cambridge economist, he set out to establish the databases on military spending, on arms transfers, and on other issues, other problems, nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons. And on almost all of these, the young researchers were told at the time, you can't do it. It's not possible. The information is not available. And they said, okay, so well, let's try. And the information was available, much more than people thought. And SIPRI has never used secret data from a government. It's always public source data. So sometimes there are gaps in our totals and in our estimates, and we always make that transparent. The second thing about SIPRI right from the beginning, it's written into our statutes, is that we are expected to be producing research which is grounded in science but oriented to the policy world, and doing this in order to contribute to the prospects of disarmament and a more peaceful world. So when I try to explain and encapsulate SIPRI to people, I say, well, there's two strands in our DNA, right? One is allegiance to facts and the truth, and the other one is allegiance to the idea of trying to contribute towards a better world. And at this time we all pause for thought and ask if we think that the world is getting better at the moment, and if so, what kind of contribution SIPRI is making. And then we move on and say, yes, but without SIPRI and without other institutes like us, less would be known and probably things would be much, much worse. The third thing, then, maybe to say, is if you were setting up a peace research institute in the 1960s, and you take for granted that you want to provide information on military spending and so on, fill in the data gaps, what would you orient that institute towards? You'd almost certainly say the East-West, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, probably Vietnam, and basically that's it, right? Those are the big issues. Partly because, actually, the Cold War at that time sort of was like a fog that it obscured the view of many armed conflicts that were going on. But certainly, it would seem completely defensible approach to say it's primarily East-West. That's where the big risk of war lies. That's where the big risk of the big war lies. And we focus on that. If you're setting up the same institute 50 or 60 years later, you have a completely different horizon that you're scanning. And you also have different vocabulary. You have, for example, climate change, an environmental crisis to think about. You have, for example, the word peace building, which didn't exist in the 1960s. You have, for example, the role of gender and of other horizontal inequalities to think about in relation to prospects for building peace. And actually you have a much more rounded concept of security with the idea of human security, which again was a notion that didn't exist in the 1960s. Human security as an idea was launched upon the world in 1994 in the Human Development Report of that year. So today, if you're thinking what would be the right research agenda for a SIPRI, you probably still think, yeah, the nuclear weapons and the chemical and the biological weapons and the more modern versions of the hardware, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, outer space, all of that, right? But you would also be thinking not only in a much more focused way on the wars which are actually going on around the world, of which at the moment there are 52, but you would also be thinking about climate change, the environmental crisis, food insecurity, health issues, and their relationship to security questions. So SIPRI today has a much broader agenda than we had 60 years ago. But we started there and we've expanded the view.
Okay, so how independent are you? Can you decide yourself who is in the board, for example, and what influence does this board have on you?
Okay, so there's something which is, in a way, it's a Swedish peculiarity about SIPRI, which is that we are both an independent institute and we have a board that is appointed by the government. It's a cabinet decision to appoint board members, nominated by the institute. So the institute has three kind of deciding bodies internally: the board, the research staff collegium, and the trade unions. And if the three agree on a candidate to be a member of the board, we then nominate that person, and the government agrees. So it is a little bit of an oddity, and sometimes I think it's a little bit difficult to explain outside of the Swedish traditional social democratic context of how you can have that. But we are, yes, our voice is independent. We do not give anybody who that gives us grants or money the right to censor or adjust what we're reporting, and it would be entirely counterproductive if somebody were to do that. Why would you give a grant to an evidence-based, fact-based institute and then try to tell it not to tell the truth? I mean, you know, I guess there are people who do that, but we got a grant one time from, or we've had a grant more than one time from the Chinese government. And when I sat down with Chinese representatives, the first thing I said was, you need to understand that we are independent. And once you have given us the grant, we will carry out the terms, we will write the report, and we will conclude what we want to conclude. And if you don't like it, then don't give us the second grant. Actually, as it turned out, they didn't like it, but they still gave us the second grant. It was a very kind of paradoxical outcome there. But, I mean, we are pretty fierce about that independence, and have to be. I think it's no secret that, of course, those in power quite often do not like the truth. But, you know, we need to, and so far we have managed to stand up for it. And I think it's really important in the world today. I mean, there's so much of supposedly, you know, fake news, false facts, people in information bubbles. We're very old-fashioned about this. We dig in our heels and we say there is such a thing as truth, and we get as close to it as we possibly can. And if we're making mistakes, then since our methodology is completely transparent, I mean, it's on our website, you can find out how we generate the data. If we're making mistakes, then tell us we're making mistakes, and we'll try to do our best to correct those mistakes.
I'm not 100% sure you answered my question fully. You say we, and then you explain.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the board? The board is appointed by the government.
No,
what is the role of the board?
No, I include we includes the board. The board is there for strategic guidance, for helping us with networks, for thoughts and insights about the world and where our research could and should be going over time. And it's there for financial responsibility. And it's the check upon the management of the Institute. There is, I suppose this is by convention rather than by regulation, there is one Swedish member of the board who's the chair of the governing board, and the others all come from elsewhere, the USA, France, Singapore, Ghana, UK, Ireland. So, yeah.
No, I'm asking how can, when it comes to, also a question about influencing, that is, of course, the funding.
Mm-hmm.
So how is your work sort of influenced by who is funding and for what they are funding?
It's not influenced in the sense of do say this or don't say that. It is influenced, obviously, by what donors are interested in and what their priorities are. So, and that's true if you think about research councils, it's true if you think about governments, it's true if you think about private foundations. They are going to be providing resources for activities that they think are worthwhile, whether that's research or conference or whatever it may be. There are cases where we set out to persuade a government or another donor that you should be interested in this issue and you should be funding research on it. And sometimes we succeed with that and sometimes we don't. There are other cases where a government either makes a general call or comes to us specifically and says, this work we think needs to be done. And if we're interested, then we pick it up and move on with it.
Okay, so how have you historically been funded?
I think that probably for the first, I'm not quite sure about this, but I think for about the first 25 years or so, it was almost exclusively Swedish government funding and almost exclusively with a core grant. And over the years that has changed. So at the moment we are about 35% funded, maybe 36, 37% funded by two grants from Sweden. One is the core grant and the other is a strategic grant. And for the other 63, 64%, we're funded by other governments, by the EU, by UN agencies, by private foundations, by research councils, so by a mix of different funders.
So would you say that you by this mix of funding that you are influenced in what you are doing and how you are doing?
I think if there's a risk, it is that we go after questions which are popular amongst the donor governments in particular, and maybe the EU, rather than picking on ones which are, regardless of whether they're popular, are important. Right? So I think that there is a risk there, and I think that almost all grant-based organizations face that risk and manage it in different ways. SIPRI has a strong reputation, is regarded as authoritative in many parts of the world, and so therefore we quite often have an open door when we go to a government and say, you know, this is something which you really should be looking at and funding.
Okay, so now we come to the present situation with the change of government and new policies. How has that influenced you when it comes to funding and also changes, political changes all around?
The two main grants that we receive, one is stable, and therefore its value is being reduced by inflation. That's the core grant. And the other one has the strategic grant from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is using some development funds and focuses onto development and peace questions. That has been reduced quite sharply over the past 2 years. So this provides financial challenges for us, obviously, and means that we have to focus quite hard on fundraising and trying to open up new connections, or where we have connections, having to go to people and saying, well, we know you like this work and now it's time to put up some money for it. The other question which you're asking, I don't think that we have faced any kind of effort at, I don't know what people might be thinking, but at politically kind of clipping our wing, our freedom of action. The main thing that I see is that compared to how it was in 2015 when I started this job, I meet the state secretaries and the ministers much less frequently than before. So in that sense, we have less contact and connection at the political level. But in the foreign ministry and in other parts of the government that we're interested in and who are interested in us, I think we still have very good networks and very good connections. We talk to a lot of people, we're in touch with them. So yeah, there's been a change, but it's not been a kind of a censorship kind of change.
But you have met with the political leadership, and have you had any dialogue with them on your work and the situation all over the world?
Yes. So we've had meetings and exchanges with 2 state secretaries in the foreign ministry, and we gave a briefing to the foreign minister. And we're working on having a meeting. We've agreed mutually to have a meeting with the development minister quite soon. But as I say, it is less contact than I was used to in the, let's say, the pre-pandemic period.
And have you been successful to find other funders to meet the gap that has been created?
Yep, so far yes. We met the gap for 2023. So, you know, too soon to say whether we have succeeded for 2024, but we're working hard and we're hopeful.
And how do you see the future then?
Well, we don't know in terms of the finances. Yeah, we don't know whether the strategic grant will continue. We hope so. It would be a blow if it did not, but, you know, problems are only there to be solved. I think that some of the contacts and connections that we have made to broaden our funding base will continue. We are, amongst other things, looking more actively than we have in the past to try to find support from either individuals or entities in the private sector. So yeah, a more diverse funding base, which actually walking on many legs is a good way to look after your independence. So if there are worries about independence, we are probably going to be better placed in a couple of years' time than we might have been, or than we might have looked a couple of years ago.
Okay, I think you have covered quite well the past and also slightly on the future. And I think we have a good picture of SIPRI today. If you have any additional questions on this more general level. Yes?
I have one. It's very interesting. My mic. Thank you. My name's Aurora. I study social analytics, applied social science. You mentioned cases where you have been successfully persuaded funding and sometimes not successfully persuaded funding. Can you give 2 examples of that, or any specific case you remember? I was very interested in what types of cases are something you want to, but maybe it's not a popular question.
Thank you. We've made a habit since 2017 of working with an elected member of the UN Security Council on the climate change and security file. And that started working with the Swedish government in its membership in 2017-2018. We then moved on to Germany, Norway, Switzerland, and those were fairly easy cases. But the example I'm thinking of now is that we're working with South Korea. And that was a little bit of a kind of introduction of a new idea for the officials that I first spoke to about it, a kind of blink of, oh, yes, we could do that, that would work. And then we explained what we do and how that works, and the more they thought about it, the better that seemed to work. So that was one example. Another one, unfortunately it's on exactly the same theme, and I'm sure that if I had a little bit more time I would think up other ones. But in about 2020 I got the idea that, 2019 I think, I got the idea that with the 50th anniversary of the first ever International Environmental Conference, a high level, was coming up, and it would be held in Stockholm because the first one was held in Stockholm in 1972, so 2022 there would be another conference, and that would be a good time to bring out a report about the relationship between our environmental issues and peace issues of a certain kind of weight that's enough to metaphorically pick up and hit people over the heads with. When you do a big report like that, not all of your target audience reads it. They tend to read the executive summary or the 2 bullet point message or the tweet. But it's reassuring to know that there's a whole lot of research and facts and science behind it. And so I just had that idea, and I thought 2022 was also good because the previous one by then would be 7 years old. It had come out in 2015. I'd also worked on that one, so I kind of knew what we should be doing. So I got in touch with various people in the Swedish Foreign Ministry, and that started the process, and we got that. I talked to Norway about it, and we got some support from there. I talked to Swiss officials whom I knew about it, and we got some support from there. So we had a multinationally funded Environment of Peace report, which landed right on time in May and June 2022, in time for the 50th anniversary. And that was completely an idea that somebody had and took to 3 governments and got their support for it. And ones that didn't work, too numerous to mention.
Okay, I think that we now turn to the second part of this meeting. I just want to, I forgot to say when I started, this is a joint meeting between FUF and the Svenska Europarörelsen. And it's very nice to see that there are people from both sides, and young and little older people in the same meeting. Very nice. So Annika takes over from here.
So let me check if my mic works. It does. So then I'll leave that mic with you. Thank you all for being here. And as Lennart said, it's nice to see this mixture. We don't have that in the European movement in Sweden, I'm afraid, but I hope that we can have young people joining that movement as well, because it's really about our destiny. So thank you, Dan, for also being willing to share your insights when it comes to the world and to Europe. I believe that for Europeans today, what we have on our mind is that we are experiencing a war in our immediate vicinity. For the Swedes, that we joined NATO. That I would say we're looking to the European elections in June with, I guess, a mixture of hope and fear. So I'd like to talk to you about what the militarization of the world and Europe today, what it means also to the European Union as a peace project. As we all know, it started as a peace project between France and Germany after the Second World War. And what SIPRI's research shows when it comes to this situation. And then we'll come back to some other issues.
So what's your question?
First I should say that Dan is not only the head of SIPRI. Dan has been the director of International Alert, which is actually a dialogue and mediation institution of PRIO in Norway, similar to SIPRI. And we first met when we were working on peace building in the United Nations. So your overview is important, and putting Europe then at the center, since we're looking at the European situation, would be useful. So my question is, how do you see the militarization, both of the conversation and in real terms in Europe, and where will that take us? And is it possible to combine with other activities and actions?
Well, I mean, first of all, and I think for obvious reasons and in a process which everybody is seeing in the papers, European military spending is increasing. That's part of a global increase in military spending. Military spending has increased for 8 years in a row worldwide, and it will carry on rising. European spending is a big part of that, in part because of the increases in Ukraine and Russia, but also because of the increases in EU, Europe, military spending. Our data on that will come out in April, and that's why I'm a bit fuzzy at the moment. Our outreach people would be horrified if they found me releasing the information a month early. But the data on arms transfers has come out, and in the last 5-year period compared to the 5 years before that, Europe's arms imports increased by 97%. It's a horrifying increase. So that's reflecting, in a way, that militarization. At the same time as Europe is importing heavily, it's also exporting heavily, and it's exporting in some of the same kind of categories as it's importing. So the heavy increase in imports is not a sign that Europe really lacks military industrial capacity in, for example, advanced fighter aircraft or missile technology, which it is importing, because it's exporting those same things. And there are detailed military choices and preferences and tactical reasons and so on, which explain that, along with, since the main arms supplier to Europe, or to Western Europe especially, of course, is the USA, along with a kind of a transatlantic politics aspect of weapons procurement. So that's one part of it. The second thing, I think, is that we're looking at a near future in which, one way or another, there is a 2,000-kilometer long armed fortified border between the West and Russia. That border is either going to include the eastern border of Ukraine, because Ukraine gets back its sovereign territory, or it's going to go through Ukraine. Those are the two options which are available. And that's going to be fortified, and that's like the Cold War border in the middle of Europe, only bigger and longer, and with as many surveillance devices, but much more sophisticated ones, and a huge amount of artificial intelligence and so on to monitor what's going on. The end of the Cold War, in approximately 1990, there were 50 armed conflicts going on in the world. And what happened with the end of the Cold War was that the UN Security Council was able to start acting It was no longer hobbled by the fact of the veto and by disputation between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So despite then increases, spikes in conflict like the Balkan Wars and Rwanda and Darfur, actually from 1990 until about 2010, the zone of peace worldwide was expanding. There were more peace agreements than ever before. They were more durable, increasingly because of all the effort that was going into not just making peace, but building peace as a long social process. And the wars were, in general, when they happened, they were shorter and they were less lethal because the international community had more instruments available than it had had before to be able to step in, and more will, and was more able to act like a community. Since 2010, that has changed. Now, one can talk about the reasons for that lying in different places, including in the economic crisis of 2008, 9, 10. But that's when the statistics start to shift and the numbers of wars start to increase. And we are now back up over 50. As I mentioned earlier, there are 52 wars going on at the moment. So Europe can never be immune from this. But in addition, there is the war that is going on in Europe. I think it's very important at this point in the discussion to remind ourselves that this is not about the return of war to Europe after decades of peace, right? That's the wrong Europe to be thinking about. That's the social democratic Northern Europe, decades of peace, right? In Ireland or in the Basque Country, or in places which have been hit by terrorism, or in the Balkans, or in Cyprus, or in Georgia, or between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You don't think of this as being a long era of peace. But this is the most serious war. It seems to be now already more lethal than the Balkan Wars were. It's always difficult to know exactly how many people have been killed and how many people have suffered in other ways through a war, but the estimates of mortality are over 200,000 people already and are climbing. That's at the low end of the range of estimates. So not surprisingly then, the discourse has started to shift, and you see less and less space for thinking about, peaceful relations. And I'll stop now and let you ask your second question and see if your second question gets as long and involved an answer as your first one. But we are having, there is a problem at the moment of just getting into our heads the idea that since the zone of peace in the world expanded in a 2-decade period from 1990 to 2010, we know it can be done. So we know that it could happen in future as well. At the moment, I think everybody shares the same problem of wondering what's the first step that gets us from here to there.
The features of the Russian invasion in Ukraine are of course different from the many other violent situations you mentioned, in the sense that it has been perceived or is perceived as Ukraine fighting for Western values, upholding the fort for the rest of Europe against Russian aggression. So my question in this regard would be then, would you believe in negotiations around this, which is anathema for the time being? And if so, what kind of way forward would you identify if you think that what you just said, that it's possible to again go down when it comes to conflict levels?
Well, as I said, I think the difficulty is to find the first step. I think that we are still in the same place as we were a year ago, which is that there is no clear pathway towards the end of this war, right? There's no clear pathway towards victory for one side or the other, and there's no clear pathway towards a negotiated settlement. Each side denies the legitimacy and indeed the credibility of of the other. I mean, Zelensky has said, I don't believe a single thing that the President Putin says, and Putin has said of Zelensky, I mean, well, he's a Jewish Nazi gangster. I mean, you know, it's kind of, you know, the rhetoric is very hot on both sides. During 2023, the territorial position barely shifted at all. So at the beginning of from February 22, when the re-invasion happened, that's the beginning of a second phase of the war, the first one being based on seizing Crimea and the seizure of territory in the eastern Donbass. That territory added up to 6% of the land area of Ukraine. Russia's first offensive after February 22 meant that by about the end of March, beginning of April, it was essentially not in control of, but kind of held 25% of Ukrainian territory. And by the end of 2022, with the successes that the Ukrainian army had around Kharkiv and down in the south, near the Dnieper itself, in Kherson, the percentage was back to about 16% at the end of 22. And at the end of 23, it was also about 16%. So there have been tens of thousands of lives spent and very little actually happening. It seems now that Russia has made more territorial progress, but it's still quite limited. And I still think that it is impossible at the moment to see a clear Russian victory or a clear Ukrainian victory. It's difficult to see peace negotiations. So I wouldn't come up with a negotiation plan now, but I think that there can and should be quieter contacts going on, and that should be happening all the time to sense out what the possibilities are. Some of those can be informal, some of them will be formal but secret. And at the same time, we need to start thinking longer term to try to get our heads around the question, how do we live in Europe? How do we live alongside Russia in any scenario that comes out after this war?
And that takes us to the fact that we, in Europe and in the United States and Canada, we see this as a military confrontation. Basically, there's no opening for negotiations. And you're, of course, right when you say that we will have to coexist. There are also many different views in Europe and in the United States when it comes to this kind of coexistence. And that takes me also to the European elections, where I believe that in the parliamentary elections we will see more of a debate around foreign policy issues for the EU and security policy issues for the EU than we've had before. At the same time, we know that there are many different views in the EU. You have Hungary, Slovakia and others nurturing their relationship with the Kremlin and Russia. Do you think that when people go to vote, that this will play in? Will fear play in? Will the wish for a negotiated settlement play in? Or is this still lower on the agenda of the European elections?
I think it'll be higher than it was, but probably not the predominant issue. And I think it'll be interesting, but I would imagine it would be very difficult to see clear trends come out, because, as you said, there's very diverse range of opinion in the different European countries. So I think also that there's a further factor which, in thinking ahead about Europe, which is that further factor is called Trump.
That was my next question, so please go ahead.
Well, I mean, you know, I think we should certainly not spend all of our energy on Trump, partly because that's what narcissists want, is they want you to spend your energy on them. And it frustrates and irritates me that we spend so much time thinking, what if this, what if that, all about that guy. Secondly, I think we need not to think ourselves, and Americans need not to think themselves into the sort of this is inevitable. But obviously there is a possibility there, and it raises enormous questions for Europe. A Trump foreign policy is almost by definition unpredictable. So it's not, I don't think it is as clear as he seems to make it that he would, were he to become president, he would immediately sort of turn off the taps on the money and, you know, leave Ukraine abandoned. But imagine that to be the case. What would Europe, or the European Union, then do? I think that that is a, you know, that is one of the elephants in the room in the conversation amongst European leaders at the moment.
Maybe we can see Macron's view that it was not excluded to have troops on the ground in Ukraine in that context, that Europe needs to flesh its muscles to show that it can also deal with the situation on its own.
I must admit that at the moment I would be surprised to see European combat troops.
I would too, but
on
so
the
it's
ground.
more about what Macron's intentions behind saying this.
I mean, Macron has talked before about what they call strategic autonomy, and while that term has become kind of not quite anathema, but you know, there's a sort of semi-toxic reaction to it amongst some of the other security establishments in Europe, they are nonetheless talking about those kinds of issues from time to time. It's just that they'd rather not. It was a big relief for traditional Atlanticism, as represented especially, for example, in the UK, that Biden came back because he's a traditionalist in American foreign policy. Trump is the disruptor. If Trump were to come back now, and there would be some degree, I think, of disengagement. It might not be as dramatic as he seems to signal in some of his speeches, but there would be some degree of disengagement, and possibly some degree of saying to President Zelensky, you've got a problem, you go sort it out, you've got to sit down and talk to him, you know, we're not going to bail you out forever. I think that Europe's options at that point are restricted, but I would expect to see indeed some institutional move towards more independence from the USA in foreign and security policy, planning and thinking in Western Europe, or Western and Central Europe. The problem is that there is not at the moment an institutional basis for that. So that would need to be developed and constructed, and that to me would be the big indicator to me is whether or not it is possible, in the light of a potential Trump presidency, to move quickly towards an institutional basis for European cooperation in security and defence matters that is independent of the US. Now,
and it's quite obvious that efforts have been made over the years,
yes,
not least by France, to actually build the EU as such
yes,
an institution.
And which didn't work, partly because the Brits would never let it happen, so that problem has vacated. But there's also other reasons, other issues behind that. I mean, one thing is that if Europe as the European Union feels worried about Russia, and it looks at Russian forces and sees how great they are, they could always look at SIPRI data and see that Europe outspends Russia on the military by a massive amount, by about 3 or 3.5 to 1. So
and still counting.
And still counting. And so why is it then that European forces kind of feel, in many people's eyes, weak compared to Russia? Well, it's because of national sovereignty. So if you want strong defense against Russia, if you want to get more bang for the euro, then no worries, you just have to start uniting armed forces and do away with having, 27, 28 different national establishments. The transaction costs of European military spending are so high compared to Russia.
What you're saying now is actually going beyond the collaboration existing in the NATO structures, since it's also an intergovernmental institution with national decision making. And so you would say that the way forward would be a European entity for defense?
No, I wouldn't say
without
that.
National sovereignty?
I wouldn't say that in the sense of, is that what I want to see? What I'm saying is that if you're going to bang on about the Russian threat and still maintain your small little back gardens of military effort, then you're being inconsistent. You're not seeing your own logic. Now, would it be good for there to be a European military bloc to arise in some kind of rivalry with the US and also in confrontation with Russia? No, I don't see that as being a recipe for a peaceful world. But I do see that as being the direction in which some of the discourse is currently taking us if there is a Trump presidency and if there is no way out of the Ukraine war.
I assume this, if this is further developed in this direction, it will also contribute to the bloc building in the world, where you have a certain group around Russia, Iran, basically China. We do not really know where they stand, and some attach even hopes to China to step in and find a solution to Ukraine's sovereignty. And this takes us to the question of the multipolar world and the role that Europe can play now with so many different hot spots where power is concentrated.
So I think it's been a mistake to be thinking about world politics in terms of the sort of the clash between democracy and autocracy. I don't find that to be a useful way of understanding the world. So many of those that ally with the democratic states are not themselves democratic. There's, the reality of they may be sons of bitches, but there are sons of bitches is still alive in the policy in the US and indeed Britain and France. As the EU, as they look towards the rest of the world. I think also that it assumes a unity on the other side, which also doesn't exist. And I think that the relationship between China and Russia needs a lot more careful analysis. It's not the case that there is a China-Russia bloc. It's not the case that there is a China-Russia, Iran, North Korea bloc. If you look at North Korean policy, and that's one of the topics I focus on a little bit, North Korea, the regime in North Korea since the division of the country has always been uncomfortable with dependence on China. So that's one reason why it is moving very fast to make a stronger relationship with Russia. At the same time, for Russia, if it is economically weakened, and even more so if it's militarily weakened by the war in Ukraine over the long term, then China looms even more as the big brother in that relationship than before. So Russia may be getting closer to China, but that's not a comfortable place for it to be either. And China is also much more closely linked through trade with the rest of the world than the USSR ever was. So also the Cold War parallels don't quite work. I think it's true, nonetheless, what you're saying is that there is this sort of formation of blocks and mini blocks around the place which is starting up, and that is, in many ways, it's a multipolar world. One could argue that multipolarity is actually better in the long run for stability and for peace in most countries and most regions in the world than a bipolar rivalry. I think there'd be a lot of sort of theoretical discussion each way on that within international relations. But if we have that more diverse world, if that's the reality we face, rather than arguing is it theoretically better or worse than another option, what do we do in that context. And in that context, you need actors, unofficial ones and official ones, who are trying to make connections and links and offer bridges and so on. And if one is part of a bloc, it is harder to do that than if one is not part of a bloc, which is a long way round saying that's the room for manoeuvre in world affairs that existed when Sweden and Finland were not in NATO has been restricted by this kind of compacting of everything, of almost everything in the European space into NATO and into a bloc.
But you can also say that if you look at Norway, they have a foot in the door in many, informally and formally, in many conflicts. So this is actually possible to do even if you are a member of a military bloc. It's
been possible for Norway to do it in relation to, obviously, for example, the Middle East, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Sudan to a degree, bits in the Sahel, all of which are out of area. The challenge is to see whether that is also possible with a confrontation or a set of issues which are much closer to home, or where there are alliances and alignments that come very close to what, for the sake of shorthand, one could call the East-West dividing line.
We have the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe involving Russia, the Central Asian countries, Canada, the US and all the rest of European countries. And Finland was planning to highlight the 50 years of the Helsinki Final Act, which actually was the first step in ending the Cold War, later on to celebrate it next year on the 50th anniversary. I think this will be a very humble celebration. And so this is what you mean, that a country like Finland will not play that role anymore?
Well, it's more difficult for it to play that role than it would have been if it were in NATO. I mean, and saying this, I fully understand why Finland and Sweden have gone into NATO. I don't necessarily say I disagree with the decision, I just regret what's happening to the shape of the world as a result of that. I think that the interesting thing about the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act is to think back then to the Final Act itself and to the conference. And it started as a conference on security and cooperation in Europe. It became an organization for security and cooperation in Europe after the end of the Cold War. So during the Cold War, during the period of confrontation, it was focused exclusively on providing a forum. And that forum was very important. And it was a part of encouraging some kind of a détente. It did allow for all kinds of conversations and contacts to be happening between the different sides in the Cold War. And that function, I think, remains important. And if the OSCE can play that function, then even if the celebration is a modest one for the 50th anniversary, nonetheless that function is an important one.
I believe the problem also is that the OSCE is questioned because of the breaches of its principles by the full-scale invasion and the earlier invasion in Ukraine. So it's questioned a lot by many countries in Eastern Europe, including EU members. I also understand that Kremlin sees it as obsolete and that they want a European organization without
without the USA and
Canada, exactly, with cutting the transatlantic link. So opening up for a conference may also then bring a lot of problems to the center. So
yeah, no, I mean, again, I think that there are a lot of difficulties about seeing what's the first step, what's the next way forward. It might be that the best way is for the OSCE to remain as the OSCE, but actually realize that what it can do is very little apart from provide a forum and dialogue. One of the difficulties is agreeing a budget. I mean,
which
OSCE,
they cannot.
No. Exactly. So there's now there's voluntary contributions being made by some states that think it's important to keep it going, but there's not an OSCE budget as such as there was for the past 30 years. So it's very difficult, and this I think reflects again a bigger question, which is that the world order is really under sustained pressure. And there's been discussion about the need for a new world order, I mean, going far back. And certainly gathering pace, before, in the years before the pandemic and before the 2022 re-invasion of Ukraine. But if you look at, the way in which the UN's possibilities are reduced, at least at the Security Council level. The UN agencies, I think, a lot of them are continuing to do a really fantastic job. The IAEA, the World Food Programme, UNHCR, World Health Organization as well, despite the criticisms of it during the COVID pandemic. But the UN Security Council, with the return of the situation of being hobbled by the veto, is really able to do less and less. They're still renewing peace operations mandates, but I think they haven't agreed a new one for quite some time. And in a way, the kind of a symptom of how bad the situation is when was the last major peace agreement arrived at?
2015-16.
Colombia. Yeah. So, it's getting towards a decade without, and we were used to that happening. I mean, there were good offices, there was mediation support, there was different governments playing a role, the UN playing a role, UNDPPA or TPP as it was, DPA, I mean, as it was before, playing a part, and so on.
But also global powers allowing this agreement
Yes.
to take place because of lack of rivalry between them, and this is what we're seeing everywhere now. This is evolving. I wanted to come back to, we've spoken about Ukraine, we've not talked that much about Palestine, and the view of Europe from the rest of the world. I work a lot on the Middle East, so I can also see a lot of resentment and I would say surprise when it comes to the lack of activity from the European Union in this crisis, but also in many other crises in other continents. How do you see this?
Well, I think that the first thing is the charge of double standards and inconsistency, and I think there's no way to get away from that. I mean, it is very clear that Russia, when it invaded the re-invasion of Ukraine and the first invasion of Ukraine, breaches the UN Charter because it was breaching the sovereignty of Ukraine. It also seems pretty clear that there is evidence of atrocities being carried out, and those are breaches of international humanitarian law as well. Fighting near a nuclear power station is a deeply irresponsible thing to be doing. All of these things could be said by so many Western leaders and so many European leaders. Israel has inflicted upon Gaza more destruction than Russia inflicted upon Mariupol, if you remember that city, more than Syria inflicted upon Aleppo, and proportionately speaking, more than was inflicted on Germany in the whole of the Second World War bombing campaign. This is disproportionate. This looks increasingly, and has for a long time, looked increasingly like revenge against Palestinians rather than a military response against Hamas for their also egregious breach of humanitarian law as they made the incursion back in October. So why can't these things be said? Well, just say them. This is not, I mean, I'm angry about it, and you hear that as I speak, but this is not rhetoric. This is just, there are laws, and these actions prima facie breach those laws. Right? Just say it straight out.
But is that a remedy when you have resentment in the world about what happened in Libya or in the Western Balkans,
I think
Kosovo and
I think
Serbia?
on the Western Balkans that the charge of double standards doesn't hold. I've never really understood that charge. Over other cases, it does. But this is the most recent and most sort of clear and stark case of these double standards, because the two wars are going on at the same time. And one view has been taken about one, very law-based. A different view has been taken about the other, very policy-based. I think that part of the problem is that the international order includes the idea, if it's to function, it must include the idea of respect for agreed rules. And it must include the idea that process is really important. And that is what is kind of falling apart at the moment.
Would you say then that the EU is not defending that notion of principles and process?
Not adequately, which is ironic given that the EU itself as an institution is deeply based on principles and process.
And what can be done about this? Or is this back to Pax Americana, the era when we had understanding the era of liberal peace, as it were, and creating possibly the idea that we would not be able to sort out a relationship with Russia or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without the United States?
When I was working in the 1990s on the civil wars, or the wars in former Yugoslavia, question was constantly being put to me about, well, how do we make progress now? And I kept on, unfortunately, referring to a very old, standard, stereotypical Irish joke, which is about the man who asks somebody, how do I get to Dublin from here? And receives the reply, sir, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. So the problem that we're facing is not just how do we solve this situation. We need an answer to that. Something needs to get better, right? But really the question is, how could we have avoided getting into this situation in the first place? And there is a UN resolution about the West Bank, which Israel has been ignoring and defying for years. Why has it been allowed to get away with more than five decades of that? The pressure in Gaza was visibly building all through the summer. Electricity supply is down, most people are unemployed, humanitarian aid was the only way to get. Why is that allowed to continue without providing development possibilities for the people in Gaza? So many other questions in there, and it is of course complex to resolve the security questions for two populations that largely see themselves as being on opposite sides of a conflict. But somehow that is what is needed to be done. And resources could be available to be doing that, but have not been applied to that over a long period of time. So I don't think there is any easy way to do this. I think that probably if I were advising a government that really wanted to be making a positive contribution at the moment, I would say, well, you have to go with a certain amount of humility, and you have to talk to people and listen to people, and that would also include listening to the Israeli government, and it might also include talking with Hamas. But it would certainly include talking with other governments and opinion leaders in the area and being really quite open-minded, not coming in with your blueprint. I mean, look
frankly, I think this is what the High Representative of the European Union is trying to do. So
yeah.
The interesting feature here is that you have a lot of different opinions among the member states, preventing him from taking the action that he may want to take.
And if you look at the headlines and the news coverage, you find an awful lot about what is Biden going to do to sort this out, which is an assumption that somebody out there has both the responsibility and therefore the capacity to sort of reach in and move. Do we really believe in that? Is that really how peace is going to come about in that area, that quite small area of the world? Is that how peace really comes about in other cases, that someone from on high reaches in and moves them around? No, it's not. It's a much more difficult, organic, fragile, complex process to get there. And of course it's hard to start it in the middle of a crisis, and the better thing would have been, as my Irish friend said, not to start from here in the first place.
Unfortunately we cannot do that. I wanted to come back to the nuclear issue. It's part of SIPRI's work, but also I know that you personally follow this very closely, and I believe that there is an increased fear of of Russia using tactical nuclear arms. How do you see that, and how do you see the entire process of disarmament as laid down in the non-proliferation treaty?
So, first of all, I see those as two questions. And I think that very often when we're discussing them, I see this a lot with kind of friends and acquaintances. You know, if you know a little bit about nuclear weapons like I do, you very often get asked these questions which come out of a certain kind of anxiety. And it's very understandable, but one of the things which I see is the way in which things which are separate become intricately bound up. So on nuclear arms reductions, I mean, the number of nuclear warheads worldwide is still going down. It was about 75,000 in the mid-1980s, and it came down to just above 12,000 at the end of 2022, and will be a bit lower again at the end of 2023 when our figures come out.
Their capacities?
The capacities are, but the capacities of some of those weapons before were also pretty high. The difficult thing in that story is that what we have quite recently seen, there are different, just over 12,000 warheads includes a number which are in storage and a number which are waiting to be destroyed. Right? And that's the number keeps coming down each year because more are destroyed, they're dismantled. But it also includes operational nuclear warheads. And a couple of years ago, for the first time, we saw a slight increase in the number of operational warheads worldwide. And this is partly because of North Korea slowly increasing its small nuclear arsenal, and it's partly because of China. And China has what looks to some external observers like quite ambitious plans from the number of missile silos that have been spotted by satellites to be under construction. It seems to have quite ambitious plans for expanding its missile force, although we don't really know what the numbers will be in the end. But it'll certainly, it's about 300 now, and it'll certainly go up from there. So the second part, or the next part of the difficulty within this nice story of numbers coming down is that in February last year, President Putin pulled Russia out of, so it suspended Russia's participation in what's called New START, which is the Strategic Arms Reduction Agreement between the USA and Russia. And that is the last bilateral nuclear arms control agreement left standing, and it's now no longer operational. They're still actually respecting those totals that were agreed then. They have no move to start breaching them, but the agreement itself has been left to one side. So we might be moving into a post-arms control world, which means that about 60 years of effort on bilateral arms control, starting with the partial test ban treaty in 1963, that 60 years of effort is kind of being laid to rest, coming to an end. And that, I think, is extremely serious and a negative for the world. Then there's the question of using nuclear weapons. I remain one of those who's very skeptical about the idea of Russia using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. There are various scenarios, you know, what if it were just to use one against Odessa or one against somewhere in West, you know, but where does it use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine in a way that doesn't either blow back upon itself, because it's in the east where the fighting is, or upon one of or more of Ukraine's neighbors? When the Chernobyl power plant disaster happened in the 1980s, signs of radioactivity were picked up in Sweden, Norway, Scotland, Ireland, down to the Mediterranean. It gets around. And Russia has to think, or Putin has to think about what would be the retaliation. And there is an American scenario which kind of, I mean, it's horribly destructive, but it kind of works, and doesn't use nuclear weapons. Just mounts conventional attacks on Russian nuclear forces and does a huge amount of damage to them. And so Russia ends up militarily much weaker, with all of the condemnation of it for having broken the nuclear use taboo. And meanwhile, the USA gets all the credit for restraint in its military response. So given that, I think that Russia is actually quite far away from battlefield or theatre use of nuclear weapons. I can see those scenarios where it does it, but I don't find them convincing. I think that in American intelligence, I think there was serious worry, real worry in American intelligence in 2022 that there could be nuclear use. But by the end of that year, their conversation had settled down. It was much calmer. And what they reckon is it's if Putin's survival, his regime survival, is really seriously threatened, then perhaps all bets are off, right? And then maybe such a thing would happen. So if Ukraine were on the verge of clearly winning the war, maybe such a thing would happen. But at the moment, no. I'm one of those who's calmer.
So what you're illustrating is a paradox then.
Yes.
If Ukraine is successful on the battlefield, the risk will be
the risk increases,
higher.
but the risk or the possibility of other things happening, which could moderate that risk, also increases.
I'd like to open up the floor also for comments from the audience, and if this abrupt question from my side could get a response from somebody, you're more than welcome.
Let's take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
Do you think that NATO involvement or NATO member state involvement in Ukraine would increase the likeliness of Russia using nuclear?
Anyone else?
I'm a little bit curious about the how to solve conflicts. So when we're talking about not wanting like someone like Biden coming in and having to do something, how would have the conflict in Yugoslavia between Serbia, Kosovo and Bosnia been solved otherwise? If that were not to happen, what would be the ideal situation, or realistic, because ideal would be no war, but that's not realistic, and there's a chance of reblossoming the conflict.
Thank you.
Okay.
So over to you, Dan, on NATO and Ukraine, and on how to solve conflicts and the possible combination of military action and conflict resolution.
When you're talking about risk, you're obviously kind of making a projection, and you don't have really experience to draw on. So you can't do it like insurance risk, which is calculated according to percentages. So it's very much to do with analysis of behavior and kind of expectation arising out of that. I think that there would be a possibility that the use of battlefield nuclear weapons would move a little closer if NATO were to put forces into Ukraine, and that I think would be, or if a NATO member state were to put its forces into Ukraine in a combat role. And that I think must be in the minds of decision makers in European NATO states. But I think that beyond that, it is also that their forces, by being there, would be vulnerable. The presence of a force provides a target for a long-range missile, for bombing, for sabotage, for anything, for Russian special forces to infiltrate, etc. Right? So it's a risky thing to be doing. And honestly, if I thought of potential deployment of armed forces by a NATO state in the region, I would have thought the more likely thing is in Moldova, because there isn't a war there at the moment, but there is a potential risk. And I think I can imagine easily scenarios in which NATO governments would decide we can do something there with much less risk than if we were in Ukraine. So that's one thing. But it's all to do with possibility, and other people may have different views of what the balance of probability and possibility is in that. How do you make peace? It's a nice question. In general, where I want to start the conversation is away from the most difficult cases. So, for example, you say, well, look, you know, come on, you've got experience in you have as well. So what would you do in Ukraine? Right? And, you know, my head would explode is the short answer to that. So what did we do or try to do in former Yugoslavia was as much as possible to be bringing representatives of the different groups and the different sides together to talk, to exchange. And where I was, which was as director of a Peace Research Institute in Oslo, I was able to do that with, you know, people from local government and so on, and opinion leaders in a local area. I wasn't at all able to do that at government level. And at government level, that was massively blocked because, in large part, of the nature of the Serbian government under Milosevic. But there are other places where and other cases where you would think that the conversation would be impossible. And have people seen that series, The Diplomat? Anybody watched it? Right, there's that bit at the end, the fake lecture in the fake Chatham House. For some reason, when they set up that lecture, they didn't do it in the real Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. And at Chatham House, they're furious about it. And if it's going to be done again, they want to be sure it's filmed there. But you remember, in that lecture, the guy, the American ambassador's husband, says, diplomacy never works. It never works until it does. Right? And that's the thing about dialogue. It produces nothing until you got the Oslo back channel, and you got an agreement, and you got signatures on the White House lawn, and you got the PLO returning to the West Bank.
And if the rest is disaster.
Well, if opportunities had been taken, the rest would not have been disaster. I think it started actually to go wrong even before Arafat returned to the West Bank. But, you know, it could have gone in a different direction. It never works, it absolutely never works until you get the IRA issuing a ceasefire announcement. And 3.5 years later you have the Good Friday peace agreement. It never works until the different sides in Guatemala get together. And, you know, and all of these are things which were in some way or another facilitated by groups or individuals from outside, providing a space, very often being very patient and very calm and very forgiving, and just letting the conversation move on and see what's possible. If it's not possible, it's not possible. You're in the phase of it doesn't work. When I was engaged in this kind of work more, I used to console myself by thinking that failure was only success that hadn't happened yet. You need a kind of, you know, a quiet, buoyant optimism to get through that.
This takes us to the question also about the European Union's role as a contributor to work in this field that you described: diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, local communities being brought in, very often in after civil wars. Now we have intergovernmental wars, which is more difficult. But I was thinking of this, that we are now investing a lot in armaments and other security features in the traditional sense. What do you think will happen with efforts in mediation, conflict resolution, climate, gender, and also the more abstract threats like AI, cyber, and so on? Will we be losing out on that focus, and what will that then bring?
I think for a while it's likely that we do. I really regret that. I think it's a mistake. But is there a?
Oh, there's, I don't know what that's. I think there
oh, it's just noise outside. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think even when it comes to government, that there's a lot of people in government, quite often in the finance department of a given government, and I'm naming no names and taking no examples, who find it difficult to understand that the first line of defense is diplomacy. And that in order for diplomacy to be working, you need or you benefit from having a whole lot of other things going on, which are not formal diplomacy, but informal contacts and so on. And I think that at the moment, that is one of the ways in which our discourse is changing, and changing for the worse, is that understanding this, the full range of things is part of what security, in a genuine sense of the word, is about. Some of that is being lost, and there's a focus instead onto military provision for security. And I would not, I'm not a pacifist, and I'm not against all armed forces. So I would not at all deny that the military do have a role in providing security. And I think it's a responsibility of governments to provide that kind of security. But there are other things, other activities which have a role, even if you only think about external challenges to a country's security. If you're thinking also about human insecurity, or if you start to think about the ecological crisis and the challenges that is posing and is going to pose, challenges which on current way of doing business, those challenges are only going to get worse, then you have a whole range of other things that you should be resourcing and contributing to, as well as the military, in order to provide security. So the debate sometimes gets to be very, very narrow. At the same time, I think that the discussion is not over. It can sometimes seem to be over, but you know, while one government is pivoting against really trying to do something about the connection between climate change and insecurity, another government is focusing harder on it. While one government is saying that, you know, addressing gender issues in peace processes is a waste of time, another government is saying, don't you dare go supporting a peace process unless gender issues are fully included within that. So the discussion is really very active. And you know, from my side of the arguments, we need clearer evidence and better arguments and clearer arguments to make the case about what works and why it works.
I think we have come to the end of this very rich and interesting discussion, and I thank Annika for leading this discussion, and I thank Dan very much for having given us so much of your time and of your mind, and I will give you a small gift from which is
thank you.
Which is both
a wonderful bags.
Yeah, both a nice case, but also it's actually we have had a small project which we have supported, or a very big project, Global Peace Hub, which unfortunately ended because the government have decided not to support peace questions anymore. And this is a few of the documents, and then I want to give you a little of history.
Thank you.
You have to look back while you go forward.
Absolutely.
And you did so very much during this discussion.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.